If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The gun smoke still hung in the street like a haze that would not lift. The wooden boards of the saloon were splintered from stray shots. The sheriff's office door hung crooked on one hinge, and blood pooled in the grooves of the dirt road where men had fallen. Horses stood restless at the hitching posts, their ears flicking at every sound, still smelling the violence that had just ended. The cowboy stood near the edge of the square, his revolver heavy in its holster, his shoulders tense from the fight. He had been drawn into it unwillingly, first just watching from the porch of the feed store, then forced to pick a side when bullets cut through the crowd. The men who fell by his hand had been outlaws, men who had been raiding ranches in the territory, but that gave him little comfort. Killing never gave him comfort. His name was Daniel, though most people never used it. He had drifted west after serving in the war, carrying scars both on his body and in his head. He had lost his brother in a border skirmish and hadn't spoken to his family back east since. The towns he passed through were just places to sleep and places to leave. He never intended to stay. The woman they brought forward was no stranger to the violence of this land. She was young but carried herself with a defiance that made her look older. Her wrists were bound tight with rope, her long black hair tangled, her face streaked with dust. She was Apache, and the men dragging her forward spoke of her as if she were nothing but a prize of war. The sheriff said she had been found near the outlaws' camp, taken when her people had scattered. The town elders declared she should be given to the man who had done the most in the shootout. That man was Daniel. Daniel felt the weight of every eye in the square. The people wanted to see if he would accept her, if he would take what they were calling a reward. He studied her face, saw the fury burning behind her grief. Her chest rose and fell in quick, sharp breaths, but she made no sound. She did not beg. She did not curse. She only stared at him as if daring him to make her fate worse than it already was. Inside, Daniel felt his stomach tighten. He had killed to end bloodshed, not to claim someone as property. The memory of his brother came back, the way he had been left behind in the dirt, powerless, and the thought of doing to someone else what had been done to his own family filled him with anger. He kept hidden behind his silence. He did not want her bound, did not want her handed over like a sack of grain. He drew his knife, not quickly, but slow enough that the crowd could see his choice. He stepped toward her, and she stiffened, her eyes narrowing, bracing for another insult, another act of control. Instead, he cut the rope from her wrists. The frayed ends dropped to the dirt. For a moment, she rubbed her raw skin, as if not believing it was true. Daniel took his canteen from his saddle, unscrewed the top, and handed it out. The square was silent except for the creak of a wagon wheel in the distance. She hesitated, then took the tin cup he poured into. She drank, her lips trembling from thirst, though her eyes never left his face. The elders looked confused, some disapproving. One muttered that he had been given a gift and didn't know what to do with it. Daniel ignored them. He hadn't come here to collect gifts. He had come west to keep moving, to keep away from people and their debts. But now he found himself standing with someone who had been thrown into his path by force. He did not speak to her, and she did not speak to him. But in that moment, something had already been decided. He would not leave her in this town, not with men who saw her as spoils. And though he did not yet understand why, he knew he could not turn away. They left the town before the sun had fully risen, when the air was still cool and the dust had not yet begun to rise with the heat. Daniel had packed quietly, strapping his saddlebags tight and checking the rifle slung across his horse. He had no plan other than to move on, the same way he had done for years, but now he was no longer alone. The Apache woman followed a few paces behind, walking with an upright spine though her bare feet left raw marks in the dirt. He noticed but said nothing, knowing that offering pity would only make the distance between them worse. The first question that hung between them was whether she would try to run. The town had released her to him, but Daniel had no desire to keep her bound. Still, he kept an eye on her through the corner of his vision as they walked beyond the edge of the settlement. She did not break away, though her silence carried weight. In truth, she had nowhere safe to go. Her people were scattered, and the land between here and their camps was filled with patrols and vigilantes who would not hesitate to kill her. Daniel understood that much. He had seen the tension between settlers and Apache bands more than once. It was not freedom she walked into, but survival. When they stopped at midday under the thin shade of a mesquite tree, Daniel opened his saddlebag and cut a strip of jerky. He sat on the ground between them and pushed the canteen toward her. She watched him closely, as if waiting for a trap, before finally taking the food. Her hands trembled faintly, not from fear, but from exhaustion. Daniel said nothing, only chewed his own piece in silence. His mind drifted back to the fight in town, to the way the elders had spoken of her like property. He felt the anger again, but pushed it down. He knew better than to think one small act had erased her fear or mistrust. By the time the sun began to sink lower, she stumbled more often. Her body had been pushed too far by captivity and hunger. Daniel stopped beside a low ridge and made camp. He spread his blanket on one side of the fire and placed another folded blanket a few feet away. She stood motionless, arms crossed, refusing to sit until the fire caught and its smoke filled the air. Only then did she lower herself, still apart from him, her back stiff. As the night deepened, the unanswered questions lingered. Why had Daniel taken her instead of leaving her behind? Why had he not spoken more than a few words since cutting her free? Even he could not give a clear answer. Part of it was duty, though not to the town that tried to hand her over. Duty to something buried deeper, something tied to the memory of his brother dying far from home, abandoned. He could not do that to another soul. The woman's own thoughts were locked behind her silence, but Daniel read the edges of them in her movements. She flinched at the sound of coyotes howling in the distance, her eyes darting to the dark horizon. When the fire crackled too loud, she pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. She did not trust him, but neither did she trust the night. Daniel lay back on his blanket, his hat tipped over his face, though sleep came slow. He knew she might try to slip away in the dark. He also knew that if she did, she would not survive long. He felt torn between giving her the freedom to choose and the knowledge that freedom could mean her death. His decision was to wait, to see if her silence would break, and to offer no chains either way. She did not run that night. When he opened his eyes at dawn, she was still there, sitting upright, her blanket pulled tight, her gaze fixed on the horizon as if waiting for something she could not yet name. The third day on the trail was harder than the last. The sun rose without mercy, and the dry ground cracked beneath their boots. Daniel led the horse along the rocky path, glancing back every so often to check if the woman was still keeping pace. She walked without complaint, but her steps were heavy, and he could see how thin her arms looked in the daylight. The townsfolk had taken more from her than freedom. They had starved her dignity as well as her body. Daniel's thoughts pressed on him. He had cut her loose, but what good was that if she withered on the road beside him? The questions that lingered from the start of their uneasy journey were still there. Did she have a family alive somewhere? Did Daniel intend to deliver her someone? Or was he just drifting with her in tow? What would happen if she spoke her first words to him? Would he even know how to answer? These uncertainties gnawed at him, but he kept them locked inside, the way he had always done with his grief. They stopped at a dry ravine by noon. The air shimmered with heat, and even the horse was restless. Daniel filled the canteen at a shallow trickle of water pooled in the rocks. He handed it to her, and this time she didn't hesitate. She drank deeply, then wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. He caught a flicker of something in her eyes. Not gratitude, not yet, but maybe recognition that he wasn't trying to break her spirit. She returned the canteen without a word. That afternoon, trouble found them. As they climbed out of the ravine, Daniel spotted movement near a patch of scrub brush. A rattlesnake lay coiled, its body tense, its head raised, the dry rattle sharp in the still air. The woman froze, her face pale, the first real crack in her stoic silence. Daniel lifted his revolver slowly, careful not to startle the horse, and fired once. The shot echoed hard against the canyon walls, sending a flock of birds into the air. The snake thrashed and then went still. For the first time since they had left town, She looked at him without anger in her eyes. She didn't speak, but her breathing slowed, and she stood close enough that their shadows overlapped in the fading sun. He holstered his weapon and turned away, unwilling to meet the weight of her gaze for too long. That night, they made camp near a cluster of boulders. Daniel gathered what he could find and built a small fire. He cut a piece of jerky and set it beside where she sat, then went about tightening the saddle straps as if the offering meant nothing. When he returned, he saw the food was gone. She sat with her knees drawn up, staring into the fire. When he stretched out on his blanket, he noticed the canteen had been moved closer to his reach, though he hadn't placed it there. It was a small gesture, but one he noticed, one that shifted something inside him. She hadn't spoken, but she had chosen to do that. Daniel lay awake a long while, turning the moment over in his mind. He knew the silence between them was thick with questions. Why he hadn't left her in town, why she hadn't tried to escape, what kind of man he was to a woman who had every reason to hate men. He had no answers that would have satisfied either of them. But he knew one thing for certain. They had taken the first step towards something different, something fragile. Not trust, not yet, but the absence of hatred, which in this land was no small thing. By the fifth day on the trail, their supplies were running low. Daniel measured each portion of flour, beans, and jerky with the discipline of a man who had lived through shortages before. The woman noticed his care, and though she said nothing, she understood from the way he divided food that he wasn't putting himself first. Still, the question lingered for anyone watching their story unfold. Where were they headed? What was Daniel's plan, and did he mean to keep her beside him forever? Daniel himself didn't yet have the answer, only the knowledge that leaving her alone was not an option. They reached a small trading post near a dry riverbed, a place with a half-rotten porch and a squeaky sign swaying above the door. It was the only stop for miles, and Daniel knew they needed to resupply if they wanted to keep going. As they approached, the woman's pace slowed. She glanced at him, then at the building, the memory of how the town had treated her still fresh in her mind. Daniel caught the look and felt a weight in his chest. He knew what she feared. Men staring, men making decisions about her life as if she weren't there. Inside the post, the air smelled of dust, tobacco, and stale beans. The storekeeper, a heavy-set man with a greasy beard, squinted at them as they stepped in. His eyes lingered on the woman longer than on Daniel, and his mouth curled into something between a smirk and an invitation. Daniel's jaw tightened. He asked for flour, beans, and bandages in a flat voice, keeping his hand near his revolver. The storekeeper counted items slowly, speaking loud enough that the woman could hear, tossing crude suggestions about how much she might be worth if Daniel ever got tired of her. The tension pressed down hard. The woman stood stiff near the door, her chin lifted, her silence daring the man to push further. Daniel watched her. She did not shrink back or look for protection. She stood with pride, but he could see the strain in her shoulders. He placed coins on the counter, then leaned in close enough for his words to land sharp. "We're finished here." The storekeeper hesitated, then looked away. Outside, Daniel secured the supplies to his horse. The woman was still tense, her hands curled into fists. For the first time, she walked beside him instead of behind. It was a choice, not an accident. She did not thank him, but her decision to stand closer was louder than words. That night, as the fire burned low, Daniel handed her his bandana when the wind picked up dust across the camp. She tied it around her face without hesitation. When she settled down, she placed the water canteen between them instead of to one side. Daniel noticed. She was no longer guarding herself from him, as if he were just another captor. Something small had shifted. The unanswered questions from before began to ease. Why hadn't she run? Because she had seen now that he wouldn't trade her for profit or hand her back to cruelty. Why hadn't Daniel spoken more openly about his reasons? Because his silence was still his armor, and speaking of his past, his family, the war, the brother he had lost, felt like tearing open a wound. But with her steps matching his, he understood that explanation wasn't always necessary. Presence itself was an answer. As he lay awake, listening to the wind push through the dry brush, Daniel thought about the trading post keeper's words and felt anger settle into resolve. He realized he wasn't just walking with her because he had freed her. He was walking with her because he could not stand to see her reduced again to less than what she was. He didn't know where the road would lead, but for the first time in a long while, he knew he wasn't traveling alone. The land softened as they pushed further west, the cracked soil giving way to patches of green where a shallow river cut through the plain. After days of choking dust and parched throats, the sound of running water was almost strange, almost too good to believe. Daniel led the horse down the slope, his boots sinking into damp sand, and the woman followed without hesitation. She knelt at the water's edge first, cupping it into her hands and washing her face, her shoulders shaking as she scrubbed away dirt and sweat. Daniel stayed back, giving her space, standing guard with his rifle resting against his arm. He understood what it meant to her. Not just water, but the first moment in days that wasn't shadowed by fear. He filled the canteen, took a slow drink, then passed it to her. This time she didn't wait or measure his intent. She drank and handed it back. For a brief second, their fingers touched. Neither spoke, but neither pulled away too quickly. Daniel looked at her then, not as a prisoner or stranger, but as someone standing in the same fight to keep moving forward. When they made camp under the willows that night, Daniel gathered stones for the fire pit while she brought sticks without being asked. It was the first task she had done at his side. As the flames caught, Daniel studied her face in the glow. She was younger than he had first thought, her expression hardened by what she had seen, but when she pushed her damp hair back from her face, he caught a glimpse of the person she might have been before captivity. He realized the audience, anyone watching their story unfold, would be wondering the same thing he now was. Who was she before all this? Did she have family still alive? Did she carry a name that mattered to someone? As if answering those unspoken questions, she finally broke her silence. Her voice was low and rough from disuse, but steady. She spoke a single word, her name. Daniel repeated it back, carefully, with the respect of a man handling something fragile. She nodded once, not smiling, not softening, but allowing him to hear what no one else in this land had cared to ask. It wasn't trust yet, but it was the beginning of recognition. Daniel leaned back, staring into the fire. He thought about the men in the trading post, about the elders who had handed her over, about his own family back east who would never understand why he was here with her now. He knew what people would ask, why he didn't leave her to find her way alone, why he carried a burden that wasn't his. The answer lived in moments like this. She had spoken her name, and in doing so, she had claimed her place as something more than a shadow in his company. Later, as the night air grew colder, Daniel gave her his coat without a word. She hesitated, then pulled it tight around her shoulders. In return, when he stretched out on his blanket, she set the canteen between them again, closer this time, not as a barrier but as a sign that what was his could be shared. For the first time since they had left town, Daniel slept without one eye open. He knew she could still run, but he also knew she wouldn't. Something unspoken had shifted in the circle of firelight, something stronger than obligation. The weather turned 2 days after she had spoken her name. Clouds rolled heavy across the plains, a gray mass that swallowed the horizon, and the air carried the sharp scent of rain. Daniel had seen storms like this before, quick, violent, and long enough to strip a man's strength. They found shelter in an old shack leaning against a ridge, its roof half caved in, the boards warped but still standing. He led the horse inside first, then checked the corners for snakes before motioning her in. She followed without hesitation. Rain hammered down, the roof leaking in steady drips. Daniel laid strips of canvas over the holes and built a fire in the hearth. She helped without being asked, carrying broken wood from a fallen beam. It was the first time they worked together without watching each other's hands. By nightfall, Daniel's body gave out. His hands shook as he tried to feed the fire, his forehead slick with sweat even as the air grew cold. The fever hit hard, sudden and unrelenting. He lowered himself against the wall, breath ragged, and for the first time since she had been taken to him, he looked weak. The unspoken question that had haunted their journey, What would happen if Daniel fell was answered in that moment. The woman knelt beside him. She pressed her hand to his forehead, then left the shack briefly, returning with damp herbs crushed between her palms. She mixed them with water and lifted the cup to his lips. Daniel tried to push her hand away, pride telling him to refuse, but his strength was gone. He drank, the bitter taste sharp on his tongue. She spoke then, not in English, but in her own tongue, low and steady. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the intent. She wasn't leaving. The storm raged for 2 more days. Daniel drifted in and out of consciousness, the fever burning through him. Each time he woke, she was still there, sometimes tending the fire, sometimes sitting with her back against the wall, eyes closed but body alert. When he thrashed in the night, she pressed a damp cloth to his face. When the roof gave way to another leak, she shifted him closer to the fire. He saw flashes of his brother's last hours in battle, alone, abandoned, but each time the memory pulled him under, he woke to find her hand steadying him. By the 3rd morning, the fever broke. Daniel sat up slowly, the weakness leaving him hollow but alive. She was beside the fire, grinding the last of the herbs. He studied her then, realizing the questions that had gone unanswered were now clear. Why had she stayed instead of running once she had her strength? Because she had chosen not to leave him to die, just as he had chosen not to abandon her at the start. Their bond had changed in those storm days. It wasn't built on promises or words, but on the fact that neither had walked away when they had the chance. When he finally managed to stand, she handed him the canteen without looking at him, as if to say nothing more needed to be explained. He drank, and for the first time, he felt something heavier than obligation between them. That night, when the storm passed and the plains lay quiet under a clear sky, Daniel stepped outside the shack. The air was sharp with the smell of wet earth. She came to stand beside him, silent as always, but this time it was not the silence of mistrust. It was the silence of 2 people who had survived something together. When the storm passed, the plains looked new, washed clean by the rain. The grass glistened under the sun, and the air was sharp with the scent of wet soil. Daniel stepped out of the shack slowly, his body still weakened from the fever, but he could stand on his own now. The woman followed him, her hair still damp, her eyes scanning the open land as if measuring what lay ahead. For the first time since leaving the town, they weren't only surviving from 1 hour to the next. They were standing at a point where decisions had to be made. The question that had lingered since the beginning finally demanded an answer. What would happen to her now? She couldn't return to her people without risking capture or death, and Daniel could not keep drifting forever with no purpose. He knew the audience, anyone watching this story, would be asking the same thing. Was she truly free to walk away? Would he hand her over to safety, or was she bound to him by circumstance alone? They saddled the horse and began moving again, climbing a ridge that overlooked the valley below. Smoke from ranch chimneys rose in the distance, a settlement nestled against the river. Daniel stopped at the ridge, the woman halting beside him. He untied the reins and placed them in her hand. His decision was clear. He wouldn't force her to stay, wouldn't claim a choice that wasn't his to make. If she wanted to ride away and take the horse, she could. He stepped back and waited. She looked down at the reins, then back at him. Her expression was steady, no longer guarded, but no less strong. Slowly, she extended the reins back to him. It was not hesitation, but decision. She wasn't choosing the horse or escape. She was choosing the road beside him. Daniel felt something settle inside him, a weight lifting that had followed him since the war, since his brother's death, since every town he had left without belonging. For the first time, he wasn't walking away. They descended into the valley together, side by side. The settlement below was no grand place, just scattered homes, smoke curling into the sky, and fields waiting for hands to work them. Daniel thought of the questions that had trailed him for years. Why he kept moving, why he never stayed. Now, he had his answer. He wasn't meant to walk this land alone. That night, they camped at the edge of the valley. Daniel shared the last of their beans, and she added dried herbs she had gathered after the storm, making the meal taste like more than survival. When they laid down by the fire, The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was steady, comfortable, the kind that came when nothing more needed to be said. By morning, the path forward was certain. They would stay in the valley, not as master and captive, not as burden and savior, but as two people who had lost too much and now refused to lose each other. Daniel had found redemption not in the bullets he fired, but in the life he chose to protect. She had found safety not in walls or promises, but in his decision to remain. As the sun climbed over the ridges, they walked into the settlement together. Heads turned, eyes curious, but Daniel didn't waver. He carried his rifle. She carried herself with pride, and neither broke stride. For the first time, there were no doubts, no questions left unanswered. They had made their choice, and in the harsh land that had taken so much from both of them, they had found something worth keeping.